Hi friends, welcome back to Quiet Time. We're going to read chapter 5 of book 4, page 36. Surprise from outer space. What? Are there going to be aliens? I don't know. Let's take a look. I don't know if I had spring fever, but I did have aching muscles following my adventure that afternoon. Besides that, I had a funny feeling in my tummy after I read the note that said dirty rat. I ate a good helping of Nutri-Nibbles, but my stomach still felt weird. Later, Og and I were both in a somewhat dreamy state when the door opened, the lights came on, and I heard a familiar squeaking sound. It's Aldo! I rushed to the front of my cage to greet my friend. I was hoping he would be a little easier to understand. Than he had the night before. Boing! Og sounded quite alarmed, and I could see why. There was Aldo's cart piled high with his broom, his mop, and his pail, lots of spray bottles and cloths, and trash bags to be filled. And there was someone pushing the cart, just as Aldo did every night during the week. But the person was not Aldo. What? Not Aldo? Eek! I squeaked. The person with the cart was much shorter than Aldo. The person had no mustache and had long hair pulled back in a ponytail. The person had on a wet red sweatshirt and gray sweatpants and black high tops. The person was definitely a girl, or a woman, a female anyway. And there was something strange about the way she moved. She tugged at her ear, snapped her fingers, and swung her arms in an odd rhythm. Still, she straightened the desk, swept the floor, then mopped it, which Aldo didn't do every night. She even dusted the shelf where Og and I lived, but she didn't seem to notice that we were there. How do you do? I squeaked up as politely as possible. Could you please tell me, what did you do with Aldo? Og seemed quite upset as he had hopped up and down, repeating one boing after another. The person who was cleaning didn't even seem to notice. She swept closer to my cage. I saw there was a device attached to her ear. Og, I said nervously, I saw a movie at Seth's house once about an alien from another planet, and that alien acted very strange, kinda like this person. Og stopped hopping and started listening. You don't think she could be one of them? I asked. Because in that movie, the space aliens captured a human and took him to their planet. I mean, you don't think that happened to Aldo, do you? Og stayed very quiet. Guys, do you think Aldo got abducted by aliens? Do you think this person is an alien? I don't know. Let's find out. In the movie, the space alien had wires in his head, too. I was sorry I'd seen that movie because it made me think scary thoughts. See that thing in her ear? She could be getting signals from the mothership. I tried not to become hysterical. That's what they called it in the movie, the mothership. Finally, the person who had done a very nice cleaning job for a creature from outer space wheeled the cart out the door. She turned off the lights without opening the blinds the way Aldo always did and left room 26. The room was quiet except for the tick, tick, tick of the clock, which seemed to be louder than usual. Suddenly, the lights came back on. The person walked back in without the cleaning cart. She came over to my cage and reached in her pocket. A ray gun, Og! The space aliens in the movie had ray guns so they could capture the Earthlings, I squeaked. She pulled out a small carrot and shoved it between the bars of my cage. Then she left again, turning out the lights so we were plunged into darkness. Eek, I squeaked when my eyes adjusted to the dark. I stared at the little carrot. I guess that's not really a ray gun, I said, but it could be an alien carrot. Boing, Og agreed. It was nice of the creature to give me a carrot, but I have to admit, I didn't touch it. Not all night long. You can't be too sure about aliens, you know. And I still had no idea what happened to my good old friend Aldo. The world looked normal again in the light of day. And the morning went along like any morning in room 26, except for the fact that Garth and Adri were both very quiet. In fact, they never even looked at each other. Then came time for recess. While Mrs. Brisbane wrote word problems on the board, I spun on my wheel, knowing my friends were out exercising on the playground. Suddenly, the doors swung open and in walked Mrs. Wright, pulling Garth along with her. He looked very unhappy. Mrs. Brisbane, you'll have to do something about this boy, the PE teacher announced. Mrs. Brisbane was truly surprised. Garth? What happened? You know our students are required to get a certain amount of physical activity at recess every day, she said, but I found this young man hiding behind the building when he was supposed to be playing ball, strictly against the rules. Were you hiding, Garth? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Sort of, he mumbled. Mrs. Brisbane told Mrs. Wright that she'd take care of the situation. What will you do? The PE teacher asked, fingering her whistle. That's between Garth and me. There was ice in Mrs. Brisbane's voice. Thank you, Mrs. Wright. Mrs. Wright left, thank goodness, and Mrs. Brisbane asked Garth to sit down. She sat down next to him. Why weren't you playing ball with your friends? She asked. Don't have any, said Garth. His face was squished up like he was going to cry. Of course you do, Garth, Mrs. Brisbane insisted. You have lots of friends. Garth shook his head. Not anymore. Mrs. Brisbane spoke very softly. Please tell me what happened. I'm lousy at softball, and when they choose up teams, I always picked last. Garth's voice quivered. Yesterday, AJ was the team captain and got to pick his players, and he picked me last even though I'm his best friend. I was his best friend. He even picked Saya before me, and she's not very good either. Then Tabitha told Seth they lost because of me, so I decided not to play anymore. Well, he sounds really sad. He sniffled, and Mrs. Brisbane handed him a tissue. I'm sure that hurt a lot. It always hurt me when I got picked last. I wasn't very good at sports either, she confided. But you're a girl, Garth told her. Girls don't have to be good. Wait a minute. Girls can be good at sports. I think he's confused. Mrs. Brisbane smiled a little. I understand that Tabitha is the best player in the class. She's a girl. Yeah, but still, it's different being a boy, Garth sighed. AJ would probably pick Humphrey ahead of me. Well, yes, he might. I am very popular with my friends. I don't know how to play softball, but I have to admit, I'm good at hamster ball. Garth and Mrs. Brisbane sat in silence for a while until I just couldn't stand it any longer. I think AJ was mean not to pick you, Garth, I blurted out. Sounds like Humphrey has something to say on the subject, said the teacher. Garth didn't even smile, though. Tell you what, she continued. You and AJ bring your lunches in here today and we'll talk. He'll think I told on him, Garth protested. I'll make sure he doesn't, Mrs. Brisbane assured him, but I can't make him choose you first. Even if he'd picked me third or fourth, I would have been okay, Garth said, just not last. Mrs. Brisbane glanced at the clock and said that recess was almost over. She asked him to feed Og some of his yucky crickets, something Garth likes to do. I headed for my sleeping hut to think about what I just heard. I didn't know a thing about softball. I'd never been chosen for a team either, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't want to be picked last, especially by my best friend. Lunchtime rolled around and Mrs. Brisbane told Garth and AJ to bring their lunches to the classroom. This was a surprising thing that had never happened before, like being in a hamster ball or Aldo being captured by aliens. Garth brought his lunch from home in a bright blue bag. Garth carried his on a tray, and it smelled yummy. Mrs. Brisbane took a container of yogurt and a spoon out of her bag, but no one, not even Mrs. Brisbane, ate a bite. AJ, Mrs. Wright said that you picked a very good softball team yesterday, she began. Yes, ma'am, said AJ loudly, but she was surprised that you didn't pick Garth until last. AJ stared down at the untouched sandwich in front of him. I was surprised too, the teacher continued, since you're such good friends. Yes, ma'am, said AJ. It's just Garth's not the best player, and I think when you're choosing a team, you've got to pick the best players, don't you? I suppose so, said Mrs. Brisbane. How do you feel about that, Garth? Garth squirmed in his chair. It wouldn't have hurt him to pick me. I ended up on the team anyways. So it made you feel bad to be picked last, Mrs. Brisbane asked. Yes. Garth looked miserable. So did AJ. Somebody's got to be picked last, said AJ. The rest of the team would have been mad if I picked you before somebody like Richie or Kurt. I've never thought of that, said Mrs. Brisbane, stirring the yogurt with her spoon. Well, now I'm mad because it feels really awful to be picked last, said Garth. His cheeks were flaming red. I guess it does, Mrs. Brisbane agreed. As far as I could see, the conversation was going nowhere. Back and forth, back and forth. Mrs. Brisbane agreed with both of them, but neither boy changed their mind, not one bit. I imagine AJ is sorry you feel bad, said Mrs. Brisbane, right? Well, sure. AJ didn't sound totally convinced, but at least he agreed. And I'll bet Garth realizes what a hard decision it was for you, AJ, she added. Right, Garth? Yeah. Garth sounded like he had more to say, but Mrs. Brisbane didn't let him. Good. Then you two can play ball together and be friends as well. After all, softball is only a game. It shouldn't be important enough to break up a friendship. Agreed? The boys nodded. They didn't have much choice. This is the last page of chapter 5. Mrs. Brisbane wasn't quite finished. Then at the next recess, you'll play ball, won't you, Garth? Garth groaned. I'll just strike out and then everyone will be mad at me. You don't keep your eye on the ball, AJ blurted out. I do too, Garth snapped back. I keep my eye on the ball and it sails past my bat. Mrs. Brisbane glanced at the clock. Eat your lunches now. You've got to keep your strength up for the next game. She sounded very cheery, but Garth and AJ looked about as uncheery as two people could be. They ate their lunches in silence until I couldn't stand it anymore. For goodness sake, make up, I squeaked. Mrs. Brisbane craned her neck to look at me. I didn't know you were so interested in sports, Humphrey, she said, and the boys finally smiled a little bit. I don't know much about sports, but I do know about Garth and AJ, and if Mrs. Brisbane couldn't get them to be friends again, then I guess I'd have to. It's just that I didn't have a single idea of how I was going to do it. The definition at the end of this chapter is for alien, somebody or something from another land or even another planet. Aliens can be any shape, size, color, but they usually want to take you to their leader. Humphrey's Dictionary of Wonderful Words. All right, friends, we'll check in again tomorrow for chapter 6. Have a good rest. Good night.